I'll never forget this. A loud bang and then a vibration. We had just taken off and there was no time to waste. Adrenaline was high and it was a pretty scary experience.
Aviation Intrigue.
Startle effect. It can get your attention and shake you to the core. But what studies have shown is that startling events like this can have a very long lasting experience on your learning. You can learn a lot from it. Join us as we share 5 examples that actually happened to us, and we'll tell you what we learned from it and how we use it as part of instruction.
When that power failure happened to me, I was teaching in a small 2-seat trainer with the learner pilot in the left seat, and I was flying on the right. We were only a couple hundred feet in the air, which is the worst possible time to have an engine failure at low altitude, possibly with nowhere to go. And I remember that loud bang and vibration and thinking, oh no, we're too low, where are we going to go? But very fortunately, the crossing runway was just below us, and I was able to make one quick turn and make an emergency landing on the runway. This was actually a really good example of startle effect. We found out later that the power failure was due to a spark plug blowing out of the cylinder, and that's what caused the problem. But aside from that, you have no time to think about what is wrong when you're having startle effect. You just have to react. And if you react with training, that's going to result in the best outcome. If you don't take immediate action at times like that, or if you don't have the training in terms of the proper reaction, the results can be disastrous. But there's more to the story. If you ever experience a startling event, especially when you're learning something new, it's something you're going to learn from and never forget. It's called the law of intensity in learning, and that creates unforgettable moments that are also, in the end, educational. Later on in the show, we'll talk about how flight instructors use startle effect to create learning scenarios. Have you ever experienced an engine failure, especially at low altitude? Tell us your stories in the comments.
I want to share with you something that happened to me and my son several years ago. We were flying back from a racing event. He's a race car driver from Birmingham, Alabama, back to Watertown, Wisconsin. We took off from Birmingham. Everything looked normal. It was a fairly clear day, nothing unusual about the weather. But like I always do, I tend to file IFR or instrument flight rule for any long distance. I just like the safety of flying with a air traffic controller watching over me, if you will. A few minutes after we had settled into cruise, the door popped open. Most of you who have flown in small airplanes know that this is not an uncommon thing. Doors can come popped open for many reasons, including pressure changes as you climb. That's what happened. Usually it's not a biggie. I wouldn't do anything about it, except in this case, my son got very startled about it. Even though I explained to him the logic that the door is not going to open, he was getting more and more anxious. That gave me no choice. I immediately called air traffic control, found a nearby airport, landed, simply closed the door, gave my son a hug, and got back in the air, and everything else was uneventful. Now, this is not a startle effect for me, but it was a startle effect for my passenger, in this case, my son. If you're a pilot, if you have a nervous or anxious passenger, that is going to affect your flying. So therefore, I made a choice to fix this rather than continuing. Has this or an event like this has happened to you before? We'd love if you can share that in the comments so everybody can learn from it.
Another common source of startle effect in flying is coming in for a landing and there's deer running across the runway. That is really, really common in places like the upper Midwest. And you can have any number of critters crossing the runway right when you're trying to land. Sandhill cranes, deer, coyotes, all kinds of things. You might have seen this before if you're flying in rural areas. How can this happen? Well, really, really big airports, the runways are fenced out to keep out wildlife. But in smaller rural areas, a lot of the fencing isn't there, and it's very, very easy for animals to wander around on the airport grounds. Add in the time of day, evening, dusk, and twilight, the animals become active, and it is very, very common to see a lot more of them that time of day. Here's another problem. Even though runways are lit up along the sides and you have landing lights when you're flying at night, it can be very, very difficult to see things moving around in the dark. And talk about startle effect. If suddenly your landing light shines on animals standing in the runway when you are trying to land, That can be a really, really scary, startling situation. So, what do you do? Unfortunately, there have been many, many instances of what we call wildlife strikes that are reported. And usually, while there's a lot of damage to the aircraft, the occupants are generally safe because you're at slow speed, low to the ground, and landing if you happen to hit a deer or some other animal on the runway. Unfortunately, the outcome is very bad for the animal that had wandered out onto the runway. There are a couple things pilots can do to reduce the risk of wildlife strikes. First is making a low pass over the runway, especially in the dark or at dusk, to hopefully chase away any animals that might be in the area. And the other is to simply avoid flying at those times of day if you're able to. I've personally experienced many wildlife encounters on runways coming in for landing, often at night, and it can be very, very startling. Luckily, I haven't struck anything, but the low passes and trying to plan around those times when you know the risk is high really goes a long way to preventing startle effect from becoming an even worse accident. I bet there are a lot of stories out there with in flight encounters with wildlife. Share those with us in the comments.
Encountering icing while in flight can be a very frightening and startling experience. We have talked about this thing in a previous episode where icing can even bring down bigger aircraft, not just small aircraft, but clearly smaller aircraft that have limited capability to deal with icing can be a very big danger. Early on in my flight training, I was on a instructional flight with my flight instructor learning to fly in instrument condition. We weren't expecting icing, and this was in upstate New York. And we started picking up some ice, and we were in a small Piper Archer aircraft. What was scary is that the ice rate was remarkably fast. We could see that suddenly everything was getting fogged up inside the cockpit, and our windshield was starting to accumulate ice. That's how bad things were. So we immediately contacted Boston Center, that is the air traffic control we were talking to, and we asked that we immediately descend. And of course, in upstate New York, terrain is a consideration. So you can't just simply descend without talking to ACC. But we were able to get out of it thanks to my very skilled instructor, plus having a plan on how to get out. Without this, encountering icing can not just be startling, but can lead to very disastrous outcomes. Trust me, I remember like this happened just yesterday. That's how vivid this memory is in my head. Thankfully, we were able to get out safely, and I can tell you the story now. Has this happened to you before? Have you encountered icing either knowingly or most likely accidentally? And what happened? How did you deal with that? Do share that in your story. And if you're enjoying this discussion, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel.
We have one more actual startle effect story for you, but before that, we'll get into a little bit about how flight instructors use startle effect in their teaching.
What is really important is never to make a training scenario become a real life emergency. So, as flight instructors, we often plan it carefully that if something were to happen for real, we are able to recover from it in a safe way. For example, if you are trying to teach a learner how to deal with an engine out on takeoff, you don't do that at low altitude. You take them up high, 5,000, 6,000 feet, and you pretend or create a situation that mimics as if you're on the ground. And that's a very safe way to do it.
A lot of simulated emergencies to create startle effect scenarios are very common to do in flight in that way. So, a really good way to add a little bit of realism is to practice those in a flight simulator where you can actually do things at low altitudes safely.
No matter what, you want to pick a safe altitude, a safe area, and always able to recover from any actual emergencies or anything that can go wrong. Because in many cases, you don't know what the learner is going to do or how they're going to react to it.
That's a good point with instructors getting to know their learners and where they're at in the process to make sure that the scenarios you create are a best fit for them. You don't want to create a startle effect scenario that scares them out of flying again, but you also want to make it intensive enough so that they learn from it. And it's that balance that flight instructors think about often when preparing their lessons.
And finally, we always use pre and post briefing sessions with the learner to make sure that whatever knowledge that we are trying to impart with the learner is captured properly and it's not misinterpreted or missed completely.
Now for our final startle effect actual example. I was flying along in good weather with another learner pilot in a glass panel cockpit. One of the modern cockpits that have two screens, a primary flight display with your instruments and a multifunction display that has engine information and moving maps. All of a sudden, the multifunction display went black. That was indeed startling to have a big black hole in the middle of the aircraft cockpit. But the training kicked in and I made an assessment of the situation. The weather was really good. We really were able to get to a landing spot without any engine information safely, and we had our crucial instruments. So in the end, it worked out okay. But the startle effect was definitely real. Now, if that had happened in the clouds or at night, that would have been a little bit closer to an emergency to not have half of your instruments working. Or if the essential flight instruments, like your airspeed and altimeter, stopped working at night or in the clouds, that may have constituted more of a real emergency. So, in that actual scenario, we were flying partial panel. In other words, part of the flight instruments had failed or were not working properly. Partial panel training is actually a very, very essential part of learning to fly and especially for instrument training because these failures can happen. Your radios can fail, your GPS can fail, certain flight instruments can fail, and you have to be trained on how to handle those, especially at night or in the clouds. Have you ever had an instrument or avionics failure in flight? Share your stories in the comments.
Remember, this show is for entertainment educational purposes only and not to be taken as flight instruction or any flight advice. Make sure you consult with a certified flight instructor for more.